can also exist dissolved in water. If oxygen could not dissolve in water, fish and other aquatic animals couldn't breathe. Fish, of course, have gills that extract the oxygen from the water in the same way that we have a nose to breathe the oxygen from the atmosphere. So, in a perfect world, and Wally the dachshund is happy here because it's a perfect world, we would have a lake. We'd have some muck down at the bottom of the lake, and we would have a little bit of algae producing a moderate amount of dissolved oxygen so that fish and other animals could live in the lake, and everything stays in balance and everything is good. But now let's imagine that we add nutrient pollution to the lake. And again, nutrient pollution is fertilizers that were applied to the land to help plants grow on the land, but end up in the lake helping aquatic plants like algae, and in this case cyanobacteria, grow instead. We love fertilizer on the land. It's very important to have it on the land, very useful to have it on the land, not so much in the lake. So now we have this nutrient pollution in the lake, and we have all of this algae and other aquatic plants growing and producing huge amounts of dissolved oxygen because plants, of course, produce oxygen as part of their life cycle. But eventually, these plants will die and they'll sink to the bottom of the lake. And what happens to them when they reach the bottom of the lake? Well, when all of this dead algae and these dead aquatic plants sink down to the bottom of the lake, it creates an ideal environment for bacteria. Bacteria come in and they start eating all of the dead plants, and they start eating all of the dead algae. It's a marvelous feast for the bacteria. Now, when you and I eat, we take in oxygen from the atmosphere, and that helps us digest our food. We could not eat, we could not chew our food, we could not digest our food, we could not take the nutrients off into our body, we could not, we need oxygen to process our food. We need oxygen to eat. Well, the bacteria that live at the bottom of the lake are no different. Just like you and I that need oxygen to eat, they also need oxygen to eat. So they take the dissolved oxygen from the water and they eat all this algae and they breathe out carbon dioxide just like you and I do. So what had been oxygen-rich water that could support life like fish and other aquatic life now becomes what is called anoxic. An meaning without, oxic meaning oxygen. This lake is now anoxic, and fish and other aquatic animals can no longer live in this water because when the algae died, the bacteria came in and ate it all up, and they use so much of the oxygen in the water to eat all that algae that now there is no more oxygen in the water, and fish and other aquatic life cannot live. So let's talk a little bit more about the fate of some of these nutrients, because if you want to think about pollution like a scientist, source, sink, transport, and fate. So let's look a little bit more at the fate, and this is a diagram showing a lake. So what happens is the nutrients that helped the plant grow, the nutrients that are now part of the body of the plant, well, they all sank to the bottom of the lake. And the bacteria ate them all up, and now they release the nutrients, and those nutrients are now down here at the bottom of the lake. They're down there at the bottom of the lake. So now when the lake gets stirred up, those nutrients go back into the water, and they can fertilize another round of growth for the algae and the aquatic weeds and the cyanobacteria. And then when now they die and fall back to the bottom of the lake, the bacteria just start chewing them up again, releasing the nutrients back down into the sediments at the bottom of the lake. So we have nutrients being washed off of the land, our nutrient pollution, remember, washed off of the land into the lake, causing the algae and the cyanobacteria and the nuisance weeds to grow. And then when they die, the bacteria eat them, use up all the oxygen, and then next year, the cycle can begin all over again. So this internal loading or this internal reservoir of nutrients can come back year after year after year just to keep feeding the cyanobacteria and to keep feeding the algae and to keep feeding the nuisance weeds that grow in the lake. And that is the difference between a healthy lake, such as in this picture, we see Wally is happy, there's our healthy lake, versus a lake that is always choked with weeds or with algae. Now, you may have figured out by now that the best way to control pollution is not to clean it up at the sink, because cleaning up a lake is very difficult. It can be done, of course, but it is very expensive and it is very difficult. So it is much more efficient, much better to prevent the pollution from reaching the lake in the first place than it is to try cleaning it up once the pollution goes into the lake and does its damage. Which is why we talk about managing stormwater, which is why we talk about managing nutrients, which is why we talk about controlling the things that wash off of the land and then can get into the lake. And ultimately, this is going to be the best long-term strategy for keeping our lakes healthy, is to keep the pollution out of the lake, control the pollution at the source, and not deal with it once it is in the sink. Now, before we close, true or false? This one example is the only kind of water pollution that you're likely to see. And of course, the answer is false. There are many different kinds of water pollution. We have many different harmful substances that can be found in water. Some of these are chemical substances, such as the nutrients we just talked about. Sometimes we might be talking about bacteria. We could have harmful or disease-causing bacteria that can get into water. Sometimes it's other types of chemicals that can find their way into water that can cause damage to either the aquatic ecosystem or to you and I. So this is just one example of many different types of water pollution. But I think it's one that you may have seen if you live at one of the lakes in Vernon, or if you have been following the news story about the beaches being closed at Lake Kapakong or at Greenwood Lake during the summer of 2019. Okay, so let's review our 4 vocabulary words. Sammy's soup tastes funny. Source, sink, transport, and fate. What was the source of the pollution? Well, this was nutrient pollution, and the source were the nutrients in the fertilizer that were put on the land. Then these nutrients washed off of the land and into the stream and into the lake. What is the transport? Well, we're talking about rainwater washing these things away, water carrying them through a stream, water carrying them through a larger stream, water bringing them to the lake, so the transport is by water. What is the fate? Well, the fate in the short term is to fuel the growth of algae or nuisance weeds or cyanobacteria or other types of things, of plants that grow in the lake. Ultimately, the sink for these nutrients is going to be the bottom of the lake, where they can come back next year and fuel more plant growth. So that concludes part 3 of our online lesson. And in part 4, we're going to talk about another type of pollution and also do a demonstration of a science project that you can do to understand one type of water pollution. So I'll see you in part 4.